be easily consolidated into the base because it's the base program. It's something that all school districts have to do, be it collectively bargain or have a school accountability report card, all those things that are just been sitting there for a long time. That's part of the base program of education in the state. Why shouldn't they be funded through the base with it? And then they actually get the money. Right now, when do we pay for mandates? It's like, I don't know, when we have some money, we'll pay you back. If you build it into the base, they're actually getting paid for the mandates that they're doing. You're going to have a similar transition issue with the targeted funds. Now, most of this, you're going to really build off of the work that you did a couple years back. It's probably 4 or 5 years back because I was actually directly involved in it, so time flies. But the economic impact aid formula is basically driven off of English learner counts, kids in poverty, and some concentration of those kids. You're going to identify programs that are serving these populations, consolidate them again, very similar to what we just talked about in the base program. You're going to figure out how much they get per targeted kid, and then it's, again, we're back to equalization. And so what does that distribution look like? Again, inequitable. So you figure out, well, then there's going to be 2 different approaches here that I'll talk about. One is to do the exact same thing you just ran through with the base program, which is set your target 90th percentile, 95th percentile, hold the ones in the far right hand harmless, and equalize over time. An alternative approach would be, and this is the second bullet here, is to link the targeted program to the base funding level. Basically, these are what we would refer to as a weighted school system, weighted funding system, where you basically say there's a relationship between how much money we need to spend on a disadvantaged kid and how much money we spend in the base program. So that if we ever do have money, we build the base and the targeted programs at the same time. An example would be, for example, maybe you need to spend an extra 20% per student who's Title I versus the base program, and another 10 or 15% per English learner compared to the base program. Now, anytime you move the base funding level, the whole system moves with it, so that you continue to recognize the relationship of targeted relative to the base program. And if you go that route, figuring out those weights is really more about, it's about figuring out what are the underlying costs of serving disadvantaged kids versus the base program. So here are the slots that you have to fill in when you figure out those costs. You basically have different measures of poverty, different measures of whether they're English learner or not, and I would suggest using, I know that PPIC has suggested only using the Title I data. I would suggest using both free and reduced price lunch data and Title I, and here's why. So they're measuring very different levels of poverty, and having just one bar for poverty is not sufficient. The needs of a kid who is below the poverty line, which is what Title I is about, are substantially higher than one that's at 185% of poverty. Those are 2 very different kids in very different family situations. And so recognizing that the needs of those kids and the cost of educating those kids may be different. And often there's data problems. This is just the real world. There are problems with free and reduced price lunch. There are problems with Title I. Some districts will have anomalies with one or the other. Using both of them will probably give you a cleaner measure. So obviously your weight for a free and reduced price lunch kid who's not eligible for Title I is probably less than it would be for a Title I kid. So you can combine the 2 measures and basically have a high weight for the Title I kid because they're in extreme poverty, whereas your free and reduced price lunch kid is a little bit less. And then if you're English learner and poor, now you have multiple hurdles that you have to get over, and maybe that needs to be additive, that you can get, if you're a Title I and English learner, that's an even higher funding level. And finally, a concentration effect for districts that have not only, that just have a high concentration of students with needs. That makes it more difficult for the classroom teacher to get to all those unique needs. If you just have 1 or 2 kids in the class that have additional needs, you can do it in the course of the day. If you have 25 out of 30, now that's a different struggle for a teacher to meet all those unique individual needs. And our funding system should recognize that. So having a concentration factor will be important. On the details on this one, I can't give you a right answer on how much per targeted student. I can tell you what other states fund, and it's more in most states. and certainly the states that we'd like to compare ourselves with. So it's probably ideal to set a high target and recognize that you're not going to get there overnight. This might take 5 years, it might take 10 years, but eventually you will get there to funding students in need with the type of money. And instead of creating a whole bunch of new categorical programs to try and address each little issue that this population has, you're better off letting districts do that and strengthen your accountability system to address it. Another critical issue in the targeted side is if you include English learners as part of your process, you need to recognize that there are both academic, through the accountability incentives to overclassify kids. This is basically saying a kid that should be reclassified as fluent, there's incentives to keep them as an English learner. You get more money through the finance system, and you get bonuses in the accountability system. So it's not surprising that there's probably a lot of kids that are overclassified that really should be fluent and this aren't right now, because it's against the district's incentives to do that. One suggestion the Governor's Committee came up with on this was basically to have a time limit on how long, at least for the finance system, that you could be classified as an English learner. You could still receive English learner services after that time period, but from a funding perspective, limit that amount, full funding for the first 4 years, and then phase it out in years 5, 6. So that after 6 years, you don't get additional funding. And let's face it, if you start the system in kindergarten and are in the 6th grade and are not reclassified, you're behind. You're going to be behind academically, and you are not going to be on a path to success. And we need to incentivize school districts to focus on those kids early and transition them as quickly as possible.
Do you say that with the assumption of adequate funding, or do you say that in our current state, which is underfunded? I mean, how do you set a timeline when you're sorely underfunding programs, I guess, and do that with some level of confidence?
If you don't transition the kids in that time frame, the probability of them graduating, the probability of them passing the exit exam, right? I mean, this, I think, is where this data came out the clearest. When you looked at the number of English learners who failed the exit exam, who started school in kindergarten here, it's not that they're recent immigrants. It's that they've been in the California public school system since kindergarten. They got to high school. They couldn't pass the exit exam. That's a problem. Yes, certainly the overall system in California is underfunded. There's no denying that. That doesn't mean that you can't necessarily use that as the excuse to not say that if kids aren't transitioning, it's okay. You know, and that may not be fair to the school districts, but it's certainly not fair to the kids to go the other way. You know, the pressure has to be on, the expectation has to be there that these kids will transition to fluency in a reasonable time period. Is that 4 years? Is that 6? I don't know. You know, that's you'll get the experts to differ on that, but it's certainly by the time you leave elementary school, you got to have transitioned.
But that would be part of an accountability system, not part of the school finance reform?
So, from the finance perspective, you don't want to have the incentive. You want to, from our perception, or from my personal perception, since that's who I'm representing today, it would be after somewhere in the 4 to 5 years. 'Cause really what's happening right now is if a student has been an English learner for 6 years, they're usually not receiving services anyway, right? They're just sort of in the system, getting by. They're kind of mainstream. They take the CELT every year, but they're not getting a lot of services anyway. So intensify the services earlier and get them out. That would kind of be the approach. On the accountability side, this really comes down to the way it works right now is if you get to the higher levels of the CELT but don't reclassify, we still call it a victory for the school because they're, you know, so you stay in these higher levels. And basically what that means is you haven't scored high enough on your STAR test, on your standards test, but you're doing fine on your development skills. So you just stay in this holding pattern, but we call it a success for the school in the accountability system. That seems problematic. Special ed, I would say stay in the general framework for special ed of the current model, but there are some things where additional investments are needed. One is, just like everything else in the state, special ed funding isn't equal across what is called a SELPA, which is a regional service area for special ed. There was an effort when special ed finance model was put in place in the early 90s to do some equalization. They did a little bit, and then they stopped. So there's a big chunk of districts at the bottom of the distribution that are all equal, and the whole upper half of the distribution isn't. There needs to be an augmentation, recognizing that the growth in high-cost kids has been substantial. So breaking down the types of special needs kids, and autism is obviously the easiest to identify here, but a lot of the high-cost categories have seen substantial double-digit growth, whereas some of the easier-to-serve categories have seen less growth. And finally, you really need to do something about the extreme high-cost kids in special ed, because these are, especially for small school districts, these can bust your budget really quickly. Now, the state shouldn't pay 100% of the cost for these kids, because you want the district to have some skin in the game that, they can't give away the farm in the SELPA agreement. Yeah, you can have a pony and a tutor and a private teacher to yourself, right? You can't have that. So the district has to have some financial obligation to those students, but the state should cost share in those needs. And there's a very small pot of money to do that right now. It's just not sufficient enough. So it's really kids that are costing $60,000, $70,000 up to $100,000 a kid. That's a lot on a district. That's a teacher, right? So you're taking out, you have to let go a teacher in this environment to serve this one kid. The state has a role in protecting, and it's almost an insurance against these really high-cost kids to make sure that the kids are being served well, because federal law requires that, but it's not dramatically impacting the entire rest of the district. Some other issues that you have to have accompany this type of finance system. You're given a whole lot of decision-making to a school district. Hopefully they're going to use that in ways that are in the best interest of kids, being as efficient as possible, and improving the quality of service. You got to make sure that that's happening. One of the key issues here is this creates the possibility for huge inequities in how those new resources end up getting out to the schools. So it may be the schools that have the kids that are generating this money, especially the targeted money, may not benefit from it. And especially if this transition starts in this sort of an environment, because districts, they just don't want to have to make cuts. And so if you give them new resources, they don't care whether it's in the targeted side or the base side. They're going to use it to just balance their budget, and that may not serve the kids that you're targeting the money to. So it's important to would be important to have a school level accountability or a tracking system for the finance data. You need to know, did the dollars generally get to the type of kids they're serving? Now, if you go to school level finance, at least in tracking where the dollars went, there are some problems. There are older schools that are more expensive to maintain. You can, that's okay. But those are things that can be justified at the local level. But right now, it's oftentimes, we have no idea. And when you do these aggregate studies of this issue, it tends to be that there's oftentimes more inequity within a district than there is across districts. So recognizing that you need the dollars to actually get to the kids to service them. So that's that trade-off between flexibility and security. You also need to strengthen your accountability system. And California passed the API in 1999 and has really not changed it since then. The rest of the country has really evolved in their accountability thinking, and California is really behind the curve in this area. A critical component is adding in growth as a factor, but an equally critical one, especially given where the state is headed with its standards, is to being able to measure whether kids are leaving the system ready for college. You continually hear, and I'm sure you've heard this time and again, our current system is forcing every teacher to teach to the test, because that's all we're basing accountability on. We want to have kids leaving the system ready for college and being successful in college, and that's a whole broader set of skills than just on the test. And so we can actually measure and track as the kids leave high school and go, do they make the transition? Did they need remediation? Did they succeed their first year? If they took remediation, did they pass it? All those things are easily linked back to the high school that educated those kids. And we can figure out whether they leave the system college and career ready. And certainly career ready is a little bit more challenging, but most in the career tech world are saying you need at least some training at the community colleges to be successful and to find a career that's going to pay a living salary. So how well do the kids leaving high school do as they transition into college? Those should be an indicator of whether that high school is preparing kids. And those changes to the accountability system will strengthen this type of reform because it will focus their attention on what really matters, which is getting kids really educated to be successful in life. So, issues still resolved, and I'm sorry, I'm just going to wipe these under the table a little bit. Adult ed, county offices, which have already been covered, regional occupation centers, because some areas they're part of the district, some areas they're not. That's a complicating factor in this area. And figuring out how to streamline the reimbursement process for mandates as we move forward, those would be other issues that would be outside of this model that still would need your attention. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. One of the things that I have been certainly thinking about, if we can move towards school finance reform and sort of perhaps kind of a second phase of it, is thinking about accountability and better governance, if you will, would we be able to get to some point where we could actually, by reforming the system, we could get to a place through the SAC system or redoing the SAC system that we could get to a place of collecting some financial data that would be a helpful and beneficial tool for local school boards as they're, looking at their achievement rate in their particular school districts and saying, well, we want to do better with African American boys in 8th grade algebra, as a goal, that they can start looking at, various investments, if you will, and try to, balance the investment towards the outcome that you're trying to achieve in terms of student achievement. And I mean, do you see that there's a potential pathway from simplifying a system to looking at different data fields within the SAC system to getting to a place where that might be able to happen down the road?
I mean, you've obviously sat on a school board. I am involved in my local school in their finance ways. And the more pots you have, the harder it is to figure out what the heck you're doing with all of them. And you know what you want to do, you know where you want to head on a school board, what your priorities are, and oftentimes it is you want to serve those kids with great need. You have no idea what your current system is doing, either in how it's currently allocating dollars, nor in all the different pots that you get to see the big pot, but there's all these little pots kind of out there, like what the heck is going on with Title II dollars, which are the dollars for teacher training that are federal dollars. I know in my local budget, I just found out we had a whole pot of money that was being really poorly used. So those things happen, right? It's like you have to be that sort of guy that wants to go and look at every single one of these little pots and say, well, what are you doing with that? What are you doing? It's the same thing you face in the budget, obviously, as you face the current education budget. There are so many little pots of money that to do oversight of all those little pots is almost impossible. This really changes that discussion of what's going to happen at a school board if there are not that many strings on it. You have to develop a program that's rational. So now that conversation between a school board member and a superintendent and the CBO is a very different conversation. It's not about all the little pots of money. It's about what is our vision and how are we going to address the needs as they've been defined locally and as the state has defined them for us. As far as the accounting data supporting that, there are huge distributional issues within districts. When you actually show board members that, they're going to be shocked. They're going to be appalled, many of them, that they've allowed this to happen for their tenure, that they've allowed the levels of inequities to continue to exist, and that they can do something about it. Now, can they do something about it overnight? No budget changes dramatically overnight. You make adjustments, but at least it's part of that information set. And until you actually have that information, it's hard to make changes. But I think that, especially in urban districts, they would get there once those members had the control of that sort of data. It would start to raise a lot of questions, which are important questions, especially as we try and address equity issues in the state.
Thank you. And you had mentioned, I think you said $3.4 billion to get to the 90% equalization. Yeah. And, I mean, do you have a number for adequacy?
I don't, because it is so elusive for the state as to not be a meaningful number. I mean, it's like start spending as much as you possibly can, in smart ways, and it's significant, right? I mean, so the getting down to facts process went through all of these things, and came up with some numbers, and that was in 2007, before we cut an additional, if you adjust it for growth, $10 billion, $8 billion? I mean, and they were double-digit investments that were needed at that point. So those numbers, the one way, this is like the giggle test lens that I try and use in talking about this issue is, look, there are some charter schools out there right now that are truly doing a phenomenal job of taking kids with great needs and having amazing outcomes. There are obviously some public schools doing it as well, but it's almost easier to isolate this small group of charter schools that are doing it, whether it's Green Dot or KIPP, Aspire, those type of schools are doing a phenomenal job. Go and look at their funding rates. And they have this Peace Corps mentality about them where they get these energized young people to help them do this, that are willing to work 12-hour days, work on weekends, work another 40 days a year, and still it's a lot higher funding level. That may be a starting place when you start to think about what you need in a finance system, because these are success stories. There's no denying it. They're taking difficult kids that have faced difficult lives and turning them into college track kids. So it can happen. It just costs them more money, because what do? They lengthen the school day. They lengthen the school year. They bring in a whole lot of supports for those kids, and they do it in a very efficient and effective way. And that's something that may be lacking in some of our public schools, but it still costs them a lot more to achieve that. So that may be like, an easier way than I have a lot of respect for the academic community on this, but it's hard to come up with a number. Professor Sonsley has done this through surveying principals, but it's just what they think. It's not what they've actually done. And I think that's what's compelling to me about this charter school approach is they've actually done it. They've lived it. And it still costs a lot more. So.
Well, I certainly believe that we probably won't get to adequacy until we reform the system, because I'm convinced that, on the natural, as you said, as we recover in the economy, there's going to be money that can flow through the system if we reform it. And if I always say it sort of parallels the achievement gap, there's a financial gap, and the more that we can narrow that, I think it will be consistent with how we improve the performance of our students. But I don't think that California citizens are going to be compelled to invest more in education until they're convinced that the dollar is spent more effectively and as efficiently as it can be spent, and that through the virtue of some transparency, there's some proof of the pudding that it is being done that way, which I think is one of the great benefits of looking towards this reform effort as well. So,
and certainly with your finance transparency, helping parents understand what their schools are getting, so that they can ask the questions of their principals. What are you doing with the money?
Yeah.
Explain it to us. Now that's a new conversation that has never happened before. Parents have never had that sort of power to be able to say, well, what are you doing with our money?
Right. And
if you show, here's how much money is going to this school site, let alone the equity issues across school site. All right, this is the money we got. That's our playing field. What are you doing, principal, to address the issues that we face?
Right.
that's a new empowerment for parents
Yeah.
that hasn't existed.
Yeah, I agree. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate you traveling here and being part of this. It's been very, very helpful, and your perspective gives us, I think, a sense of confidence and hope that this is actually doable to make this transition from the system that we have now to a much improved system, that it can be done. And quite frankly, this is the right time to do it. So when the economy does improve, we are distributing money, I think, more equitably and more efficiently and effectively. So thank you.
Yeah, and especially given that you're living in this limbo land of, you've had this Tier 3 reform where districts have the flexibility, but maybe the programs are coming back, maybe they aren't. That's got to create a lot of angst and uncertainty for business folks in school districts across the state. So addressing it now seems to make sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Again.
Thank you very much. So are there any members of the public that would like to make a comment? If so, the time would be now. And we want to be efficient with the time. I'm actually supposed to be at another meeting as we speak. So, if people will keep their remarks within 2 minutes, that would be helpful. Welcome.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Erin Gable on behalf of State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Tom Torlakson. And I just wanted to express on behalf of the superintendent his excitement about working with the chair and with the legislature on this critical issue. He believes that it's imperative to start thinking and planning now on how we're going to be exiting this period of experimentation, really, with flexibility and school finance reform that we're currently doing in our budget. And that phase right now is set to end in 2015, and we need to be thoughtful about how school districts can think now of how that exit is going to look and to do that gracefully. He wants to encourage us to be thinking comprehensively about not only looking at the issue of simplification, but also transparency, equity, and as you stated so eloquently, adequacy. And all of those issues need to be on the table while moving in parallel with a student outcome-centered accountability system that can be in tandem with accountability and finance reform. So as we're moving away perhaps from an inputs-based system, we've created the outcomes measurements we need in order to take away that safety net that we've put in place. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And please convey to the superintendent that how much we appreciate his support on this important issue, and likewise, we're looking forward to working closely with you and with him in this important endeavor. Thank you.
I'm Steve Rhodes, and I guess I'll represent the School Transportation Coalition, but I'll make a few comments first about some of the other aspects. One of the things that I think is important, and it was talked about by Robert, was the identifying how much the elementary and the unified and the high schools should get. In the old days, they got unified was about 14% higher than an elementary, and the high schools was about 40%. Now, unfortunately, the equalization, when we did the equalization of each unit by itself, and I kind of caused that, we equalized more, we put more money into the elementary schools. So nowadays, it's like unified gets like 4% more, and a high school gets like 20% more. So I would suggest that you do some studies on what those differences should be, because I think that's important. I also think
is there a place for us to go to look at that? Do you know where some data exists on that, where other states or other other data other than California data?
There must be, because you know what some of those your chief consultant would be ideal to do that. This type of thing has to be done in other states, and so it's. But we've gone a direction, and we've gone a direction just because of the way we've equalized, and the way we equalized them was separate, and there was more differences in the elementary, so we pump more money into the elementary. I think that to find out what should be a cost of a disadvantaged child is a very, very important thing, and what other states are doing. So I would urge you to consider that. The transportation system is flawed. It's flawed because we differences. Well, first of all, we only fund 35% of it, but it varies greatly. You're in Riverside, a very fast-growing county. You don't get very much. If you're a declining enrollment, you get a greater percent from the state. The proposal that I would like, I don't think I respect John a great deal, but I don't think the land sparsity will do it, because basically right now transportation funds poor kids, and those poor kids are either in cities, urbans, or they're out in rural areas. The one proposal we got legislation for, and was unfortunately vetoed, and by both, a couple pieces of legislation, one by Republican, one by Democrat, was to look at rewarding transportation on how efficient the system was run. That's being done in North Carolina, for example, that's the way I think it should be done. It will take some time to do that, but you have the economics and you have the mathematics to do that, and I think that's the best way of doing it.
Thank you, Mr. Rhodes, and I certainly want to have further conversations on all of these issues, but I've got to be efficient with my time right in this moment. So thank you, and we'll go on.
Mine in. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Madam Chair and members, Rand Martin on behalf of the California Charter Schools Association. I do want to thank Mr. Manwaring for his comments on charter schools, and a perfect segue to the opening point I wanted to make, which is that charter schools as laboratories provide some options for reform considerations as well in this regard. You know, charter schools are funded by a combination of the revenue limit average revenue limit by grade, categorical block grant, and an EIA block grant that we think have been very effective in implementation. There are inequities that continue to exist, but overall could be very instructive to what you're doing. We wholly support that direction. We do want to make sure that as reform is looked at, that some of the inequities in charter schools are looked at as well. Things like the lack of access to some of the categoricals, like class size reduction for K through 3, the being frozen out of the flex lock-in that occurred in the budget a couple of years ago, which still continues to be a problem. We're also very supportive of proposals to ensure site-level financial reporting. We think that's very important to helping us better prepare students. Right now, it's not as effective as it should be. In fact, there's discrepancies between what we see and what districts claim that we should be seeing. We'd like to see that improve, so we have a much better sense of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Samantha Tran with Children Now. Children Now is very supportive of the direction of moving to a student-centered finance system that's more rational, equitable, and based on students' needs. It was actually one of the top priority agenda items for a children's agenda that we released this year with policy goals across health and education and foster care. We wanted to come and say today that we're really appreciative that you're having this hearing, because the devil is in the details. As we get further into how we make this transition, so many things come up, and how we address it is critical. The other point that I wanted to make is Rob mentioned both the fiscal transparency piece, which the chairwoman is carrying a bill on this point, is critical, because there is a lot of distrust across the state about how districts and schools are investing in programs. And so we think it will provide greater clarity and also allow schools and school district personnel to potentially innovate and share ideas and engage parents in more appropriate ways. And finally, that focusing the state's role on appropriate outcomes for kids is core. And while it's a separate conversation from finance, it's coupled in ways that are important, because for people to feel comfortable letting go of the strings, they need to feel confident that the state is holding schools accountable for the right things. And college and career-ready indicators indicators and focusing on growth are a core part of that. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Katie Valenzuela with Public Advocates. Very happy today to be joined by one of our community partners from the Campaign for Quality Education. We work together with community-based organizations across the state on local and state-level finance reform, which has really most recently been seen in our lawsuit, CQE v. California, against the state's school finance reform. Actually, right now I want to draw your attention to the points that were made on categorical flexibility. The statute that was passed actually said that schools were supposed to account for how they spent those funds under flexibility. Like, for instance, we should know exactly how much money has been diverted from arts and music block grants since the flexibility has been enacted. But this accounting hasn't been done, nor to our knowledge have districts adhered to the public meeting requirements where they're supposed to talk with parents and students about how they were going to divert those funds and for what educational purposes. All of this to say that we are fully supportive of school finance reform and are really excited about bills like Assembly Bill 18 that are moving in this direction, but we really want to caution, like the speakers have done, about the need for fiscal accountability that goes beyond test scores so that we really know where this funding is going and that all students' needs are being met. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Point well taken.
Good afternoon, Liz Darius from Youth Together. We are a 15-year-old organization that works to develop student leaders as well as improve school conditions as well as fight for just and fair school funding. We also work with Campaign for Quality Education on our Kids Count campaign. We've served over 1,000 students. We serve over 1,000 students every year. And we support equitable and transparent funding formula like the Kids Count campaign. This is one of the major focus areas. We also support resources and funds going to meet the needs of the changing demographics in California. And I want to highlight just one example. From the students that we've worked with, we currently met a young man in East Oakland as part of Oakland Unified School District who has immigrated to this country 2 years ago, and in his 2 years has never been able to receive English language learning services at all. And this is just one example of the many students that are in the districts. We also urge that if there is a move from categorical to flex funding, that again there is accountability and then there's a way to measure these funds and there's some forethought into how the funds are allocated. I just want to highlight lastly that it's time to take action now. Our students are calling for action. Our parents are calling for action. They're actually the ones that are feeling the brunt of the state's inability to fund schools adequately. And in creating action now, there's an ability to create an atmosphere where students actually want to go to school. One of the presenters, and very thankful to hear all the presentations, we referenced a lot of the reports, talked about students being able to survey parents and principals and teachers, and I haven't heard actually folks talking about talking with students and surveying students, and we would be happy to amplify the voice of students. Unfortunately, they weren't able to make it here because they're in school right now. But one of the other focus areas is to make sure that there's community and student engagement in the process, in school funding and finance processes. So we also just, again, very thankful for the language around Assembly Bill 18, the language of transparency. And one other thing that I just want to note is, in trying to seek fundings for schools in the next few years, it would be interesting to consider and talk about debt relief.
Thank you very much.
Dave Walrath, representing Small School District Association. First, I want to thank you for calling the hearing and the panel members you had who provided a number of very thoughtful proposals and issues. We do appreciate the sensitivity to small and rural school districts and their particular issues. Assemblymember Buchanan made a very good comment about ensuring that we don't build in inequities into whatever school finance system we create when we consolidate. Being one of the guilty parties on the Proposition 13, post Proposition 13, 1 month to build new revenue limits, many of the inequities were built in. We have a more thoughtful process. We have more time. Her comments were excellent in that area. We need to look at the encroachments and what types of variations those create, transportation special ed encroachments. I hope when you go forward, we want to work with you. We want to be a partner with you. We believe creating a streamlined, transparent system is very important, that there are too many silos and pots now. And lastly, for consideration, when we start talking about buckets of money coming in, to quote Rob, if you can think about using one-time money when it occurs unexpectedly at the May revision, if it is sizable, to start buying down the inter-year deferrals, which are creating so much havoc in the school finance system, and then using the ongoing money for addressing the equity, transparency, and simplicity streamlining of a better school finance system. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll keep this short. Jeff Freitas with the California Federation of Teachers. And as we do finance reform, we need to make sure that we are financing for the neediest of students, and that's what we need to distribute the equitable cost of that, including some of the students that do not fall in the normal K-12 setting, and then their funding has been swept in, as was spoken before, such as the adult ed. That is a population that is not receiving those services, which are much needed, especially those parents of students that are ESL parents. And we need to be educating those students, and they're losing those classes. So that's something we need to think of and protect in the future, as well as be able to distribute the funds. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Monica Nestrosa with San Diego Unified. We'd like to thank you for calling this hearing. We think it was important. One of the themes that we'd like to particularly emphasize the importance of was the question of really looking at need and targeting funds based on those needs assessments. Mr. Manwaring brought up the issue of special education in particular, and he in his PowerPoint, one of the issues that he addressed was the question of the students who have the most extreme and most severe disabilities, those whose services oftentimes are, require great cost simply because of students can be medically fragile. They can require a lot of additional supports above and beyond what one would even expect of a special education student. That funding has typically come from the Special Disabilities Adjustment. It is part of the adjustment that SELPAs receive to their base rates. I wanted to underscore the importance of that and mention that San Diego Unified, in working on this, is working with members of the Assembly and the Senate to try to find a way to transition to the new system that Mr. Manwaring mentioned would be needed in order that the methodology would be more accurate, and underscore that in the context of this conversation, we'll hope you'll carry some of those notes, including the need for a stable transition and the need to continue meeting the needs of districts that have students whose services cost more. Thank you.
I'm sorry, so who are you working with now?
The bill is is AB 719, and it is being co-authored by Assemblymember Block and Assemblymember Lara. One of the co-authors from the Assembly includes Assemblymember Fletcher.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any more members of the public? Seeing none, again, I want to thank the presenters for being here. I think this was a very productive hearing. It's my desire to have some additional follow-up hearings on the topic in the interim, begin to start working with smaller groups to really try to get down to the level of specificity that we need to put into a bill to get us to the place of reforming the school's finance system in the state of California. So this is something I'm very interested in and will continue to be working on, and will be asking all of you who have been here for your input and guidance. And with that, this meeting's adjourned.